Unlike Indians, who experienced American independence as a threat to their liberty, African Americans saw in the ideals of the Revolution and the reality of war an opportunity to claim freedom. When the United States declared independence in 1776, the slave population had grown to 500,000, about one-fifth of the new nation's inhabitants. Slavery played a central part in the language of revolution. Apart from liberty, it was the word most frequently used in the era's legal and political literature. In the revolutionary context, slavery was primarily a political category, shorthand for the denial of one's personal and political rights by arbitrary governments. Such language was employed without irony, even in areas where nearly half the population in fact consisted of slaves. The presence of hundreds of thousands of slaves powerfully affected the meaning of freedom for the leaders of the American Revolution. In a famous speech to Parliament, the British statesman Edmund Burke suggested that familiarity with slavery made colonial leaders unusually sensitive to threats to their own liberties. Where freedom was a privilege, not a common right, he observed, quote, "Those who are free are by far the most proud and jealous of their freedom." On the other hand, many British observers could not resist pointing out the colonists' apparent hypocrisy. "How is it," asked Dr. Samuel Johnson, "that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes?" At the time of the Revolution, slavery was already an old institution in America. It existed in every colony, and formed the basis of the economy and social structure from Maryland southward. At least 40% of Virginia's population, and even higher proportions in Georgia and South Carolina, were slaves. These are just a few obstacles to abolition that existed during this period. Nonetheless, by imparting such value to liberty and defining freedom as universal entitlement rather than a set of rights for a particular people, the Revolution inevitably raised questions about the status of slavery in the new nation. As early as 1688, a group of German Quakers issued a protest regarding the rights of blacks, declaring it unjust, quote, "to have them as slaves, as it is to have other white ones." Samuel Sewall, who we've talked about, you read that document, published The Selling of Joseph in 1700, the first anti-slavery tract printed in America. But it was during the Revolutionary era that slavery for the first time became a focus of public debate. Pennsylvania patriot Dr. Benjamin Rush called slavery a national crime in 1773. Jefferson, as mentioned previously, unsuccessfully tried to include criticism of slavery in the Declaration of Independence. Indeed, the Revolution inspired widespread hopes that slavery could be removed from American life. Most dramatically, slaves themselves appreciated that by defining freedom as a universal right, the leaders of the Revolution had devised a weapon that could be used against bondage. The language of liberty echoed in slave communities, North and South. Living amid freedom but denied its benefits, slaves appropriated patriotic ideology for their own purposes. The first concrete steps toward emancipation in the revolutionary America were freedom petitions. These arguments for liberty were presented to New England's courts and legislatures in the early 1770s by enslaved African Americans, which you read one, hopefully, already this week. Blacks sought to make white Americans understand slavery as a concrete reality, the denial of all essential elements of freedom, not merely a metaphor for the loss of political self-determination. Petitioning for their freedom in 1773, one group of New England slaves exclaimed, "We have no property, we have no wives, no children, we have no city, no country." Some slaves sued in court for being illegally detained in slavery. The turmoil of war offered other avenues to freedom. Many slaves ran away and tried to pass as freeborn. The number of fugitive slave advertisements rose dramatically in the 1770s and 80s. Most slaves of the Revolutionary era, like Phillis Wheatley, were only 1 or 2 generations removed from Africa. They did not need the ideology of the Revolution to persuade them that freedom was a birthright. The experience of their parents and grandparents suggested as much. Here are some statistics on slaves who gained their freedom during the Revolution. 5,000 slaves fought for American independence, many of whom gained their freedom. Proclamations by royal government officials freeing states and rebellious colonies freed nearly 10,000 slaves. Some of these slaves who fled to British lines were recaptured as the tide of battle turned. But at the war's end, some 20,000 were living in New York in 3 enclaves of British control: New York, Charleston, and Savannah. Of those, more than 15,000 black men, women, and children accompanied the British out of the country. And as you can see from this map, abolition never took hold in the South, but between 1777 and 1804, every state north of Maryland took steps toward emancipation. In 1777, Vermont drew up a constitution that banned slavery. This was the first time in recorded history that legislative power was used to eradicate slavery. But even in the North, an economy less dependent on slavery, property rights impeded emancipation. Generally, laws did not free living slaves, but granted liberty to any child born of a slave mother only after he or she had served the mother's master into adulthood. This was seen to compensate for the owner's future economic loss. Abolition in the North was a slow, drawn-out process. For slaves alive when the Northern laws were passed, hopes for freedom rested on their own ability to escape and the voluntary actions of their owners. In New York City, where 1/5 of the white families owned at least one slave in 1790, only 76 acts of voluntarily freeing slaves occurred between 1783 and 1800. As late as 1830, the census revealed that there were still 3,500 slaves in the North. The last slaves in Connecticut became free in 1848. In 1860, 18 elderly slaves still resided in New Jersey. All in all, the Revolution had a contradictory impact on American slavery and therefore on American freedom. Gradual as it was, abolition in the North drew a line across the new nation, creating a dangerous division between free and slave states. Abolition in the North, voluntary emancipation in the Upper South, and the escape of thousands from bondage created for the first time in American history a sizable free black population. Free African American communities created their own churches, schools, and leaders. In 1776, fewer than 10,000 free blacks resided in the U.S. By 1810, their numbers had grown to nearly 200,000, most of them living in Maryland and Virginia. In all the states except for Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia, free black men who met tax-paying or property qualifications enjoyed the right to vote under new state constitutions. Indeed, for many Americans, white as well as black, the existence of slavery would henceforth be recognized as a standing affront to the ideal of American freedom, a disgrace to a free government. So that is it for the Revolution Within and what comes next. I hope you heard some things that were new to you. It's always fun to learn something new about a period that is very commonly discussed. And again, I want to remind you that your exam 1 is due Friday of this week by 11:59 p.m. You will not be able to submit the exam after that, so please make sure that that is completed. And I hope you enjoyed this lecture. It's a little bit shorter because you do have the exam this week, so I was trying to take that into consideration. And we will hear more about the great things happening in the new United States next week.